Would you let your face be drenched in blood for the sake of beauty in the Middle Ages? Women applied lead and mercury to whiten their skin and shave their hairlines for a broader forehead. Substances we know to be deadly today were the most sought-after beauty secrets of that era. Here is that shocking history of how they risked death for the sake of beauty. Let's look into that dark but fascinating mirror together. Welcome. Today, we are once again turning the dusty pages of time, embarking on a quiet journey through history in the silence of the night. This time, our topic is the concept of beauty in the Middle Ages. What did people do to be beautiful back then? How far would they go for the sake of beauty? You will be surprised. But before we begin, if this channel gives you peace, helps you sleep, or simply satisfies your curiosity, please take a look at the thank you button below the video. This small support is a huge motivation for us. If you're ready, take a deep breath now, close your eyes, and let's start walking together in the mirror of the past. As the morning sun reflected on the pale surface of the cobblestone courtyard, Genevieve stood straight in front of her mother. She was only 13 years old, but she had to participate in her first whitening ceremony today so that she could one day become the Count's wife. The servants applied a powder, even paler than her already pale skin, to her complexion. A vein blue paint was pressed onto her cheeks, not a rosy color. Finally, she was asked to open her mouth. When Genevieve reluctantly parted her lips, a woman approached. With a stick in her hand, she applied a dark mixture over her teeth. She didn't need to look in the mirror. She knew. Her teeth had to be jet black. Because her mother had told her. A girl with white skin and black teeth smells of wealth. But in her own reflection, Genevieve saw not beauty, but fear. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, beauty was quite different from today's aesthetic understanding. While today, healthy skin, pearly white teeth, and a natural look are considered symbols of beauty, in that period, these ideas were completely reversed. Because beauty was not just a physical image. It was also a class indicator, a cultural symbol, even a way of life blended with faith. White skin was an indispensable condition for beauty. However, this was not a whiteness achieved naturally. It meant paleness that came with nobility, not going outside, a life away from sunlight. While peasants working in the fields tanned, nobles stayed indoors and used lead-based powders to whiten their skin even further. Even though these powders eventually caused rashes, sores, and even death, the ruthless rules of fashion never changed. Another striking aesthetic standard alongside white skin was black teeth. Especially in the 14th and 15th centuries, while sugar was still an expensive and rare product, the teeth of those who consumed sugar frequently would decay and turn black. This decayed appearance was considered a sign of wealth. So, someone with black teeth was wealthy enough to eat plenty of sweets. The poor, however, had noticeably white, healthy teeth, but this was considered a sign of low class. Some nobles used substances like soot, pitch, or wine dregs to blacken their teeth naturally. Sometimes this habit became symbolic, similar to the ohaguro rituals in Japan. It was considered a traditional beauty indicator for women to blacken their teeth before marriage. Moreover, this aesthetic understanding was not limited to physical appearance. Women with white skin and black teeth were thought to be delicate, elegant, and elite. These definitions created an artificial boundary separating them from work life, the sun, the fields, and thus the lower class. Beauty was not natural. It was a privilege that was purchased and needed to be maintained. Interestingly, this understanding was more flexible for men. The standards regarding men's skin color were less strict. However, they too applied powders to their bodies, wore gloves, and used excessive perfume to hide the traces of sweat and naturalness to show their status. Because bad odor was the smell of the lower class. All this appearance was not just about physical beauty. It was also an expression of respect for God, adherence to the class structure of society, and conformity to the social hierarchy. So, when a young girl beautified herself, she was actually representing not just herself, but also the class she belonged to. Unfortunately, these expectations created great pressure on women. The body became a battlefield. While lead powders poisoned the bloodstream, the chemicals used reduced fertility, and caused skin infections. But all this pain was accepted as the price of noble beauty. Over time, sugar became cheaper. Everyone could access it. Those with blackened teeth were no longer just the rich, but also the poor. This brought an end to the black teeth fashion. In the 17th century, the aesthetic understanding changed. Whitening teeth became a distinction. White skin was still preserved, but now teeth also had to be sparkling clean. This transformation occurred with the change in economic access, not the class structure in society. When we look back today, the beauty standards of the past may seem strange, even funny, to us. But in that period, when a girl looked in the mirror, she lived not according to what she saw on her own face, but what others would see. White skin, black teeth. These were not just physical details. They were symbols of status, belonging, faith, and obedience. The air carried the coolness of April, but the young girl inside the house was looking in the mirror, drenched in sweat. In her reflection, the owl band freshly pasted on her forehead was noticeable. Her mother nodded with satisfaction. "Now you resemble a lady," she said. The girl noticed her forehead appeared even more open. But she couldn't tell if this was beautiful or ugly. While birds chirped outside, a little girl inside was relearning the definition of beauty. During the Renaissance and the following centuries, especially in Western Europe, beauty for women was not just an innate characteristic but almost a duty that required effort. And one of the most iconic, most surprising beauty practices of this period was forehead enlargement. The beauty of the forehead was the most important criterion of elegance in one era. Women with high, broad, and smooth foreheads were associated with nobility and grace. For this, hair was shaved. In some cases, it was plucked from the roots, or the front part of the head was intentionally forced to shed. Women sometimes used sharp razors or special lotions applied with vinegar mixtures for this procedure. These methods were painful and irritating. But beauty had a price, and this price was paid silently. Whenever women looked in the mirror, they saw not their own faces, but society's expectations. A high forehead was matched with an intellectual mind. Even artists reflected this understanding in their paintings. Look, the women in Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, or Leonardo da Vinci's La Belle Ferroniere, all have unusually broad foreheads. This was no coincidence. It was a fashion, and this fashion left marks that were as psychological as they were physical. Opening the forehead was not only aesthetic but also an indicator of obedience and adaptation to the social order. Women performed this practice not only to be beautiful but also to show the class they belonged to. This behavior was a silent way of saying, "This is who I am. I am whatever you want me to be." Anyway, in that period, a woman's voice was not to be loud, but her forehead had to be high. Hair, however, is a symbol associated with femininity in most cultures. Yet here, a few centimeters of a woman's hair on the forehead were almost considered a shame. Especially young girls growing up in court circles or noble families would start opening their foreheads as soon as they entered puberty. This was a kind of rite of passage, like a silent celebration of the transition from childhood to womanhood. This practice was not limited to physical appearance. While women opened their foreheads, they also gave away a part of themselves. Sometimes from their freedom, sometimes from their personality. And the most painful part was that this sacrifice often went completely unnoticed. Neither in the books of the past nor on the history pages written by men was this beauty effort given a place. But its traces always remained on women's faces, in their eyes, in their silence. Over time, this fashion changed. When a new queen came or a painter sought a different aesthetic, foreheads were covered with hair again. But even though these temporary fashions changed, the social pressures women faced remained. Because the issue was not just about hair, it was about belonging, conforming, submitting. When we look back today, behind this beauty understanding that seems strange to us lies a much deeper story. Women giving up their bodies for the sake of beauty, living according to the invisible rules of society, and accepting all this without question, that was the real truth behind the foreheads. Perhaps the little girl looking in the mirror that day was opening not only her forehead but also her future. Unknowingly, With every centimeter of hair that fell, she was disappearing a little more. If this narrative has affected you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and support us with the thank you button below to follow the traces of pains that were unseen but felt throughout history. Because history is sometimes hidden in a tuft of hair. Now let's continue. The small mirror trembled in her hands. The morning light in front of the window fell directly on her face. The young woman took one last look at the tweezers she was holding. Her mother's voice echoed in her ear. An elegant woman does not bear eyebrows. Then she took a deep breath and began to pluck them one by one, carefully, almost as if worshipping. She was hurting not her eyebrows, but herself actually, but she couldn't tell anyone. Because this was the silent burden of beauty. From the late Middle Ages to the Renaissance, even into the Victorian era, the female body in Europe was shaped according to the norms drawn by society. The aesthetic understanding of these periods determined not only fashion but also women's place, position, and even silence in society. One of the most striking practices was women plucking their eyebrows completely. While a modern woman's beauty routine is based on defining, thickening, or shaping eyebrows, in past centuries the ideal beauty understanding was the exact opposite. For an elegant, docile, and inconspicuous face, a browless forehead was almost the golden rule. Eyebrows were seen as a symbol of expression, resistance, and character. Therefore, a woman being browless ensured that she was perceived as more docile, more feminine, and more obedient. Especially for women of the noble class, this practice pointed not only to beauty but also to status, nobility, and proper upbringing. A browless face also showed that the woman could afford the time and money for her maintenance. Because this procedure required constant care. They were plucked again at least a few times a week. Sometimes vinegar or herbal mixtures were used to try to prevent the roots from growing back. However, this practice left not only physical but also psychological marks. Being browless caused a woman to carry a face that was, in a way, unresponsive, expressionless, and unemotional. And that was exactly what was desired. A woman who showed no emotion, who existed only to be looked at. Like a painting, but a painting that didn't talk or resist. Artists, painters, did not hesitate to reflect this aesthetic understanding. When looking at Renaissance paintings, one notices female portraits with no eyebrows or almost invisible eyebrows. Because this was not just fashion, it was an expression of a mindset. As a woman's expression was erased, her voice also diminished, and when the woman was silent, society was considered more peaceful. So how did the women feel? Some had accepted this process. Mothers taught this tradition to their daughters. They would say that the first step to her becoming an elegant woman was through her eyebrows. But deep down, some felt the pain. Every plucked hair was taking away a little more of herself. Every look in the mirror was seeing the mold that society had cast for her anew. Moreover, this was not exclusive to nobles. Over time, middle-class women also began to imitate this fashion. Because beauty did not come only from birth. It required effort, and the price of being as society wanted sometimes started with tweezers and continued with years of silence. The disappearance of this practice over time was made possible not by a change in beauty standards, but by women gradually reclaiming their own expressions. Eyebrows came back. Expressions emerged. Women began to speak. But the silent, expressionless, browless faces that once existed in the dusty pages of history tell us not only how women of that era had to look, but also how they should not look. Today, a few strokes of an eyebrow pencil could have been a symbol of resistance in the past. Because beauty is sometimes a weapon, sometimes a chain, and sometimes a tool of silencing. And in this story, eyebrows are not just hair. They are the trace of expression, resistance, and an unseen struggle. A young woman stood in front of the closed window. She had a silk corset in her hand. Her mother was preparing to dress her. "I can't breathe," she said in a whisper. Her mother, however, smiled. "An elegant woman does not breathe, she lets others catch their breath." She tightened the corset. A little more. The young girl's ribs sank inwards, but her mother was pleased. Her waist was now within the span of a hand. It is difficult to describe what Victorian-era women sacrificed for the sake of looking elegant. Because this sacrifice was not only physical but also like a social and psychological chain. And the metal link of that chain was undoubtedly the corset. Today, when we think of underwear, comfortable, flexible fabrics come to mind, but the first thing women of that era put on as soon as they woke up in the morning were corsets made of thick fabric, reinforced with steel boning, squeezing the body almost like a statue. But this statue was alive, and with every breath, it was crushed more. The purpose of corsets was not just to slim the waist. It was to lift the bust, push the shoulders back, keep the woman's posture within the frame of decency, and most importantly, force her into the ideal female form. This ideal was often not even realistic. The narrowed waist led to health problems ranging from displaced organs, compressed lungs, to broken ribs. Even the doctors of the period were helpless against this. Many young girls were condemned to these tight corsets before their bones were fully developed, and this situation hindered their growth. Ribs were sometimes permanently deformed. But society's only reaction to this physical damage was, "How elegant you look!" In fact, this elegance was a kind of invisible bondage. Women had become alienated from their own bodies. They suffered while sitting. They were afraid to take deep breaths. The circulatory system slowed down. Pressure was put on the stomach, and fainting became commonplace. This is why there are so many fainting women in Victorian literature and paintings. Sometimes from emotion, sometimes from lack of air. But the reason for all of them is the same: the corset. And these corsets were not only worn by women but were also considered a symbol of how well a woman was raised. When a girl was introduced to her first corset by her mother, she was no longer considered a child. Because being a woman meant getting used to pain. It meant learning to be squeezed silently, to endure while smiling. Moreover, this pressure was felt not only physically but also socially. A woman who did not wear a corset could be stigmatized as loose, immodest, or a bad example to her surroundings. A woman in society was evaluated not only by her shape but also by her submission to that shape. Therefore, corsets were not just a garment but also a symbol of upbringing. But everything has a limit. As the 20th century approached, women began to rebel. As women's rights movements rose, women had to break those metal hoops first to become owners of their own bodies. Voices rose saying, "We want to breathe." Women realized they didn't have to die to look elegant, and finally, the corset ceased to be just a fashion element. It was replaced by more flexible, healthy, and free alternatives. But history still whispers to us about those narrow, steel-boned, silk-covered instruments of torture. Every whisper sounds like the crack of a rib to the ear. With every remembrance, a woman breathes again. Because today, women deserve not only to breathe but also to live in their own bodies. And every corset should be remembered as a symbol of a moment in the past when a woman had to fight with her identity. Being elegant no longer has to mean suffering. A woman gliding down the steps of a cathedral stopped. Her eyes were on the ground, but everyone else's were on her hat. That strange headdress extending from both sides of her head, almost high enough to hit the windows, was like a bird's wing floating in the air. It swayed when the wind blew, carried carefully among curious glances. But no one asked if she could breathe, how her neck withstood the weight. Because that hat was not just an ornament, it was a status. The hats that marked the end of the Middle Ages, especially the late Gothic period, were called hennin. But among the people, they had other names. Devil's horns, women's towers, or closeness to heaven headdress. To some, it was a symbol of elegance. To others, it was a sign of nobles going mad with fashion. The truth is, these hats were not just a fashion. They were also a social declaration. Hennin hats were usually cone-shaped, but some were designed like horns with 2 points extending upwards. These hats could be designed starting from 20 centimeters to almost 1 meter in height. Veils made of tulle or lace completing the hat sometimes reached the ground, making women look as if they were carrying a tower on their heads. These showy headdresses were worn by women who wanted to show they belonged to the upper classes of society. Because the size of the hat, the quality of the fabric, the jeweled decorations used gave a direct message about that woman's social class. The bigger it was, the richer, the more ornate, the more noble. It was an elegant way of saying, "I am here, and you are not." However, this fashion brought many difficulties with it. Hennin hats were so cumbersome and tall that women had to bend down to pass through the door of the house, needed help from servants to protect their hats in windy weather. Even in some periods, churches tried to ban them, deciding these hats were distracting. But bans only bound the common people. For nobles, fashion was above even God's law. The physical difficulties of the hat were additional. Special collar supports were used to support the neck. Hair was styled for hours, hidden pin systems were set up for the veils to fall properly. All this effort was just to be looked at for 5 minutes longer at an evening ball. Furthermore, these hats not only affected women but also stirred reactions from society against the fashion obsession. For the lower classes, these headdresses could even mean challenging God. Some preachers associated these hats with the sin of pride, condemning women wearing such showy headdresses as an expression of vanity and ostentation. However, as every age has its own fashion, this too passed with time. As the 16th century approached, hennins were replaced by lower-profile headdresses, bonnets, and hats. Women now kept their heads closer to the ground, not to the sky. But these hats, left behind in pictures and stories, continue to surprise us even centuries later. Today, we might laugh at those tall hats, but for the woman of that era, this was not ridiculous. It was an identity. Wearing that headdress was a way of saying, "This is who I am," without speaking. And perhaps the only place a woman could be visible to society was on the top of her head. On one of England's foggy mornings, a woman looked in the mirror. There were purple marks under her eyes, fine wrinkles on her forehead, faint spots left by the sun on her cheeks. She didn't like the image in the mirror. She had been made to believe that the measure of beauty was a deathly white face. She opened her lavender-colored bottle. From it, she took out a milky liquid with a slightly metallic smell. She dipped her finger and applied it to her cheeks. The only thing she felt at that moment was coldness. But what would burn her soul along with her skin days later had already begun at that moment. In the Victorian era, women's understanding of beauty was quite different from today's. For a woman to be considered beautiful then, she needed to be not tanned, but pale. Because paleness was an indicator of delicacy, purity, and belonging to the noble class. A tan was the mark of labor, of poor lives spent under the sun. Therefore, for aristocratic women or those who wanted to appear aristocratic, a white complexion was a must, and to achieve this, methods far from natural were employed. At the forefront of these methods was a chemical mixture called ceruse. This mixture was obtained from a combination of substances like vinegar and lead carbonate. So, women were essentially applying lead to their faces. Ceruse temporarily made the skin appear bright, smooth, and porcelain-like. But at the same time, it burned the skin from within, clogged pores, killed skin cells, and even over time led to decay in the chin and tooth loss. Interestingly, this lead-based makeup was common not only among lower-class women but also in royal circles. It is even said that the famous Tudor Queen Elizabeth I used this substance frequently to keep her complexion deathly white, and over the years her skin became almost like wax. The cracks on the Queen's visage were even reflected in the paintings of the period's artists. But she was still continued to be seen as the pinnacle of elegance. But the lead didn't just stay on the skin. It seeped underneath, entered the bloodstream, and over time damaged the nervous system. As its use continued, women began to experience headaches, vision problems, shortness of breath, and even miscarriages. But the problem was not in the effect of this poison, but in the poisonous nature of the beauty perception. Society's standard of whiteness for women was so powerful that they mistook the path leading to death for the way to achieve beauty. Over time, the harms of ceruse were scientifically proven, but this did not stop its use immediately. Because beauty was determined not by knowledge, but by gazes. To get a share of these gazes, women risked their bodies knowingly, accepting decay in front of mirrors adorned with lead. This whitening craze was not limited to makeup. Some liquids and plant mixtures drunk at the time were also marketed with the claim of paleifying the skin. These mixtures contained substances like opium, arsenic, and mercury. So, for the sake of beauty, women were poisoning not only their faces but also their internal organs. On the supermarket shelves where we choose makeup products to be beautiful today, laboratory disasters awaited them back then. For the women of that era, beauty was not just something seen in the mirror. It was the only way to survive, to get married, to be accepted in society. So, to look beautiful meant, in a way, to live, and that's why they could go as far as giving up their lives. So, what do we see when we bring this story to today? Maybe we don't apply lead to our faces today, but we have digital mirrors now. Filters, an obsession with perfection, new glowing skin trends emerging every day. LED may not come out of boxes anymore, but it is still applied to our minds. Throughout history, humans have pursued beauty, but sometimes the cost of that beauty even masked the smell of death. The faces whitened with lead in the Victorian era actually tell us something. Elegance can sometimes be poisonous, and every era that accepts the definition of beauty without question produces its own kind of lead. In a mirrored castle, there was a woman holding a silver-handled comb, combing her hair. Her deathly white skin was beneath layers of dried powder and perfume. Her servant approached her. She was about to leave a pitcher of water and soap when the woman slightly raised her eyebrows. "Don't touch me," she said. "I will be receiving guests today." The servant quietly withdrew the water. Because she knew. In that house, there was not water and soap, but rose oil and chalk. And more importantly, being clean did not always mean being elegant. Though it may seem strange for today, it is surprising to see that the concepts of cleanliness and beauty have not always gone hand in hand throughout history. Especially in Europe, from the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance through the Victorian era, being clean was often seen as a habit of the lower class. While perfumes flew through the air in palaces, noble mansions, and lavish balls, it was known that hands and faces went unwashed for weeks. For the noble class, water was a suspicious substance. Because according to the prevailing medical belief of the time, water opened the pores and made it easier for diseases to enter the body. Therefore, washing, especially bathing, was considered a dangerous activity. Moreover, heating, carrying, and preparing water was a luxury. It required servants. Consequently, the upper class had produced alternative solutions instead of cleanliness. Foremost among these solutions was perfume. Strong scents like lavender, rose oil, and musk were frequently applied to unwashed parts of the body. Clothes were scented with perfume, and even incense burners were placed in rooms. Scent had replaced cleanliness. To be elegant meant to smell good. But what was hidden beneath the scent was not spoken of. Powders and makeup products served the same purpose. Body powders, face powders, and tinted creams were used to cover dirt and skin blemishes. Women lived for weeks without washing their faces, only adding new layers. Hair was combed but not washed. Special scented combs and brushes prepared for them aimed not to remove the oil from the hair but to distribute it. For servants and the lower classes, the situation was very different. They were familiar with water. Because they worked, sweated, and spent time in the outside world. This made washing necessary. How ironic it is that those seen as dirty in society were cleaner, but those referred to as elegant were hidden behind scents. Elegance and cleanliness had diverged so much. Thus, even in times when diseases were rampant, the upper class remained distant from the bath. During the plague era, public baths were closed in many parts of Europe. This reduced the public's access to water. But the aristocracy had its excuse ready. Water spreads disease. This fear left a great impact, especially among women. Some diaries written in that period detail how women lived for months without washing their bodies, using only perfumes and makeup. A similar contradiction existed regarding clothing. Layers of dresses worn on top of each other were not washed. Underwear was not changed frequently. Stylish touches were made with laces, scarves, and brooches over the soiled fabric. This appearance became an indicator of social status. It wasn't important for the garment to be clean. as long as it looked showy and expensive. However, these habits brought health problems with them. Skin diseases, lice, skin irritations, and infectious diseases were common. But despite this, these topics were not discussed in public so that the perception of nobility would not be tarnished. Because it had to be confessed, for the sake of elegance, peace had been made with dirt. Over time, science advanced, and the germ theory emerged. Especially in the second half of the 19th century, cleanliness began to gain more importance. But even this transformation progressed slowly. Because destroying a perception was much more difficult than cleaning a body. When we look back today, we see that cleanliness was associated not only with water and soap but also with a value, and this value changed according to its period. In the Victorian era, while cleanliness was associated with peasantry, disease, and simplicity, dirt was intertwined with power, elegance, and status. Perhaps the most striking truth was this: society absolved people not with water, but with its gaze. The only thing echoing in the dim streets of the town at night was the muffled scream of a young girl. She had buried her hand tightly in her mother's palm and closed her eyes. In the small room resembling a kitchen behind the house, an old woman was heating a thin needle in the fire, then dipping it into a sooty ink. When she pressed it into the girl's skin, the mother's lips moved in prayer. Because this pain was not just any pain. It was the pain of a tradition, a community, a belonging. That tattoo was not just a shape, it was a part of life. When we look with today's aesthetic understanding, it might be surprising, but in history, beauty is very closely related to pain. Tattoos, piercings, body modifications, and similar methods were not just for adornment, but also for marking identity, social acceptance, expression of faith, and sometimes rebellion. But it was always painful. Beauty was a struggle etched under the skin. Ancient societies were no strangers to piercing and tattooing their bodies. In ancient Egypt, women pierced their navels. This was considered a symbol of both fertility and closeness to the gods. But this piercing process was far from today's sterile methods. Bone fragments, bronze needles, fish bones, all were used just to look beautiful. Prayers were recited to alleviate the pain. The area was fumigated with burning herbs. Sometimes lullabies were sung to little girls to distract them from the pain. Tattoos were a badge of honor for warriors, a mark of ownership for slaves, and for women, sometimes just a seal indicating they had reached marriageable age. During the Roman era, some slaves were even tattooed on their foreheads, a symbol of humiliation more than beauty. But on the other hand, among northern tribes, tattoos were considered sacred and an element of attraction. The black motifs running from the wrists to the necks of Viking women made them privileged and untouchable. Each needle stroke added another layer of value. In the Middle Ages, things changed a bit. The Church considered any intervention on the body an insult to God's creation. Tattooing and piercing were stigmatized as diabolical. But among the people, these traditions continued to live underground. Especially among nomadic communities, for example, among Romani people, piercing ears, noses, or lips was still a sign of beauty and belonging. Some women even started carrying their husbands' names or clan symbols as tattoos after marriage. In the Victorian era, with the development of modern medicine, the pain became somewhat more bearable. But the irony was this: as the pain decreased, the meaning of piercing began to change too. These procedures ceased to be a necessity and became a tool of luxury and display. English aristocratic women would secretly go to tattoo artists to have elegant designs done on their shoulders or ankles. But these had to remain hidden. Because in public, they were still perceived as rudeness and aping the lower class. Piercings hold a special place in the transformation of pain into aesthetics. In some societies, lip piercings meant a vow of silence, while in others, they were interpreted as enhancing sexual appeal. Nose rings, from India to the Middle East, were a symbol of both beauty and wealth. But it must not be forgotten, these jewels passed through wounds opened by needles. Infections, inflammations, and permanent pain. Beauty had a price to pay. For women, this price was often paid silently. Because the command, "be beautiful," that society imposed on them was shaped at the tip of a needle. Grandmothers would pierce their granddaughters' ears at a young age, embedding the pain into tradition by saying, "A girl without earrings will remain a widow." Beauty was about resisting pain. It was proof of being strong, both spiritually and physically. When we look from today's perspective, all these procedures may seem like pains endured just for aesthetics, but they actually carry a much deeper meaning. Beauty through the needle was a reflection of belonging, a culture, and a silent resistance. The more women were pierced, the stronger they became. The more they were tattooed, the more visible they became. Every mark was a story, and these stories were written on the skin with a needle for centuries. A whisper spread behind closed doors. Even when women talked among themselves, they hesitated to say some words openly and would imply them. When someone said, "That woman dresses too revealingly," what they often meant was not a décolleté or a short skirt. It was the visibility of the ankles. Because in the past, when a woman showed her ankle, it was not only shameful but also considered provocative. A man's glance catching a woman's ankle could be an event big enough to burst the vein of shame in society. Although it seemed like a harmless body part appearing from the edge of a lace, it actually represented one of history's most repressed desires. The covered-up history of foot fetishism. From the Middle Ages to the Victorian era, the female body was constantly fragmented and brought under control. Arms were covered. Breasts were suppressed with corsets. Hair was hidden with scarves, and then it was the turn of the feet. The more society suppressed women, the bigger the suppressed thing became, and feet were at the forefront of these suppressed areas. Because when something is forbidden, its appeal increases exponentially. The Victorian era was one of the periods where these prohibitions reached their most refined yet sharpest form. Women had to hide their feet under long skirts. Even showing the tip of their shoes on the street could be perceived as a modesty. Even fashion magazines of the time criticized improper ways of walking. They advised women not to take too wide steps, causing their skirts to open. The ankle had become an object of fantasy for men. Because it wasn't visible, and anything unseen is doomed to grow in the imagination. Shoes became part of this fantasy. Lace-embroidered, buckled, silk-covered narrow shoes were produced not only for beauty but also as a symbol of desire. Some men made a habit of stealing women's shoes. This was not just theft but a distorted expression of repressed desire. The foot inside the shoe was never fully seen but always imagined. So, the shoe was an object that both concealed and implied. In the East, especially in China, this perception was taken to a much more extreme point. With a tradition called lotus feet, the feet of young girls were bandaged from the age of 4 to 5, broken, and shrunk. The goal was not just aesthetic. Small feet meant an obedient woman. A foot curled in pain was actually a symbol of a repressed soul. And this painful deformation was once accepted as a standard of sexual attractiveness. In Western societies, because the foot was directly associated with desire, it was kept hidden. Some moralists gave sermons saying, "A woman showing her feet causes provocative fantasies in a man's mind." They advised women to bow their heads while walking on the street and to tug at their wide skirts. A momentary glimpse could cause some men to write love letters, some women to be ostracized from society. A wrist, a sock, a buckled shoe. All these were seen as aspects of women that needed to be controlled. Even at home, the situation was no different. Women would not walk around barefoot even in front of their husbands and always wore socks. Because bare feet were equivalent to nudity. Foot baths were special and private rituals performed only with the help of servants. A woman would hide her own feet like a secret that should not be shown. This was the covering up not only of the body but also of desire. Foot fetishism was born as an indirect result of this pressure. As everything repressed turns into fantasy, the foot became a symbol of desire. In French literature, English romantic poetry, German painting, the image of the hidden foot was always processed, and it emerged most often in dance scenes. A skirt rising while dancing, an ankle visible for a second. That 1-second image could represent all the sexuality of an era. Today, fantasies about feet may be perceived as individual preferences, but they are actually a culture that has evolved as a result of centuries of repressed aesthetic perception. Because throughout history, beauty was not presented freely. It was always presented by being covered, and everything that is covered eventually emerges in another form. One morning, the lacy hand of a newly awakened aristocratic woman dangling from her window in Paris streets was noticeable. With an elegant wrist movement, she guided the small glass bottle she held behind her neck, behind her ears, and towards her chest. The city was just beginning to breathe, but she had already adorned herself with scents. This was not her cleanliness. It was her way of showing her social place. Because in that era, washing with water required courage. Soap was a luxury, even a habit viewed with suspicion at times. Cleanliness was measured not by wiping away sweat but by masking odor. From the dark corridors of the Middle Ages to the showy mirrors of Renaissance palaces, even under the huge hats of the Victorian era, one thing did not change: people took refuge behind scents instead of washing. Cleanliness was represented not by visuals but by smell. The body was not scrubbed with soap. Aromas like rose oil, amber, and musk were poured over it. The more expensive a woman smelled, the more noble she was thought to be. Therefore, smelling good became not only a matter of hygiene but also a class identity. Soap, especially in periods when it was made from animal fat and ash, was known for its bad smell and was seen as a coarse material used only by the lower classes. Cities had almost no access to clean water. Canals served both as sewage and drinking water. In such an environment, bathing was almost like an invitation to disease. People masked their sweat, body odor, and skin problems not with water but with scents. This is why the perfume industry was born and grew rapidly. Especially in France, cities like Grasse became the perfume centers of the world. Rose, jasmine, lavender, orange blossom, all were distilled into small glass bottles and applied to the bodies of queens, dukes, and countesses. However, this was not a luxury exclusive to the aristocracy. The lower segments of the population also began to create their own scents. Dried herbs, flower extracts, essences mixed with alcohol. All these procedures were like a veil thrown over sweat and dirt. There was no cleansing. There was only the art of covering up. Perfumes were also seen as protective against diseases. And during plague times, people would hold a handkerchief under their noses, dripping rose oil, clove, and vinegar onto it. This was a ritual believed to prevent bad odors from entering and keep disease away. After all, the miasma theory dominated at that time. Diseases were transmitted through bad smells. Therefore, smelling good was seen as a medical defense as well as a social one. But behind these scents lay a suppressed truth. No matter how much you masked the odor that emerged when the human body went unwashed for months with expensive perfume, that natural reality would still seep through from underneath. Especially in crowded balls, theater halls, and church ceremonies, where hundreds of unwashed bodies gathered, even the most beautiful scent would become suffocating. Therefore, scent choice was almost a diplomatic strategy. Who to sit next to, which essence was used, what social message was being sent, everything was part of a theater. Women would sprinkle flour on their hair instead of washing it to make it matte, then scent it with lavender oil. Men, on the other hand, would sprinkle scented powders inside their wigs, especially. Wigs were not removed for weeks, scents were refreshed for weeks, but water never touched them. Because water meant disease. Soap was coarse and for the poor. The image of cleanliness was the crystal bottle of perfume. Some women, to make their scents more effective on special occasions, would drip essence onto hidden areas, behind the knees or inside the elbows. Because those areas were warm, the scent would spread more strongly. These small details showed both a woman's personal aesthetic understanding and her social intelligence. Therefore, a scent could be not just an essence, but a message, an invitation, a shield. Today, the lavender or jasmine scent that pleases our nose was a mask in those times. It was the olfactory illusion of a life distant from cleanliness, a culture needed with a lack of hygiene. But that illusion was so convincing that even in lives spent without soap, people could feel elegant, clean, and noble. In short, in the past, scents were used not only to be beautiful but also to appear clean, to protect against disease, and to show class. There was no soap, but there was perfume, And perfume was not just a pleasant smell trapped in a bottle. It was a way of life of an era. There was a mirror, gilded, with a massive frame darkened by time, like a silent witness judging whoever looked into it against time. The same question hung on the face of the woman who stood before this mirror every morning: should I look thinner, or does being a bit plumper look more noble? This question does not belong to a modern woman. It was an uncertainty that preoccupied the minds of dozens of women from the Middle Ages to the Victorian era, changing with the times but never disappearing. Because the perception of beauty was not just about aesthetics. It was an indicator of a class, a lifestyle, even a belief. When we look with today's eyes, the words nobility and fatness are rarely mentioned together. However, history is rich with examples that will surprise us on this subject. Especially during the Middle Ages and the Baroque period, fatness was a sign of wealth and power. The richness of their tables, the abundant consumption of meat and sweets was a privilege only elites could access. Every extra kilo on the body was a clear indicator of, "I don't work, I'm not in the fields, I sit and I eat." Thinness, on the other hand, was identified with poverty. Prominent facial bones, sunken cheeks, narrow shoulders, these were signs of illness and poverty. The nobles were plump. Because they could eat plenty of food, they could make servants dance even if they didn't dance themselves, and they could remain at the top of society without moving. Therefore, when you look at the paintings of the period, especially female figures are depicted with rounded curves, full bodies, thick arms, and short necks. However, over time, things changed. After the Renaissance, Europe's aesthetic understanding began to transform. Especially with French fashion, slenderness and elegance came to the fore. This was a period when thinness began to slowly turn into a symbol of beauty. But this thinness was not sought in gyms or diet lists as it is today. It was seen more as a sickly romanticism. Pale skin, thin wrists, a slightly hunched posture. These represented an elegant and fragile woman. Especially in the Victorian era, this understanding became firmly entrenched. But women sought ways to make themselves sick for the sake of fashion, not healthy ways to lose weight. They held their breath with corsets. They pushed their ribs inward. They sometimes squeezed their bodies enough to damage their internal organs. Because a thin waist was now the symbol of aristocracy. A thought prevailed: the thinner you are, the more noble you are. But the irony is this: for men, the situation was the opposite. They still considered a broad-shouldered, meaty, strong-looking body as ideal. Women should be elegant, men should be majestic. So, even the aesthetic understanding of the period was shaped by gender. The less space a woman occupied, the more womanly she was considered. The more space a man occupied, the more powerful he was considered. This situation affected both visual culture and clothing. While women walked around with layered skirts and waist-cinching corsets, men displayed their presence with wide coats, puffy trousers, and large hats. In some periods, a countercurrent emerged. For example, in the post-revolutionary period in France at the end of the 18th century, bourgeois women who wanted to integrate with the people made thinness a form of protest. The plump women of the past were now giving way to frail free spirits. This time, extreme thinness indicated an intellectual and revolutionary stance. But this didn't last long either. Fashion turned once again, and fatness became popular again. Another striking point was the relationship between pregnancy and weight. In ancient times, a woman looking fat was considered a symbol of fertility. In fact, many women tried to give this impression with corsets that enlarged their breasts and pads that made their hips look wider, even when they weren't pregnant. Because a woman who could bear children was considered valuable in society. Therefore, fatness was also presented as a feminine virtue. But no matter what, the only common thing was this: a woman's body was constantly wanted to be shaped into a form. Sometimes it had to be thick, sometimes thin, sometimes dazzling, sometimes barely visible. But it always had to serve a purpose. And what that purpose was determined not by fashion magazines, but by those who sat on the throne. When we look today, this past perception of weight may seem strange, but under the conditions of that day, demeaning a body carried forms the basis of many of today's beauty standards. So, the answer to the question is still not entirely clear. Fatness or thinness? Beauty or health? Perhaps the main issue is this: a woman's weight never belongs solely to the woman. She stood in front of an old mirror. In the silence of the night, she looked at her hands for a long time. Her fingers were almost nothing but bone. Thin, elegant, but pale. They were bare. Veins winked from under the skin like thin blue paths. As she put on the lace gloves her servant brought, she asked her reflection in the mirror, "Do I look noble?" This was the question thousands of women asked the mirror in the mornings once upon a time. Because nobility was much more than a title. It was a behavior, a posture, an aesthetic rule extending to the shape of the body. Today, hands are often limbs we don't pay much attention to. But in past centuries, a woman's hands were symbols that told which class she belonged to, how she lived, and how valuable she was. Especially in aristocratic classes during the Victorian era and before, long fingers, deathly white skin, and thin wrists were like the invisible seal of female nobility. Why were hands so important? Because hands gave away a woman's daily life. Hands that worked in the fields were thick, cracked, darkened by the sun. The hands of servants had calluses. The fingertips of those who sewed were rough. Whereas an aristocratic woman did no work. Her hand should be as soft as a pillow. Her fingers should be long and delicate like piano keys. She ruled not with her hand but with her gaze. Therefore, protecting the hands was done with great care. Special gloves were worn when going out in the sun. Lemon juice was used to whiten hands. At night, hands creamed and wrapped in cloths were kept wrapped until morning to preserve softness. In winter, women would hide their hands inside their cloaks even while walking outdoors to prevent them from chapping. Thin wrists were the finest detail of aesthetics. It was an area that a man looked at attentively, a mother wanted to see in her daughter, and painter reflected with his most elegant brush strokes. Thin wrists represented the fragility of womanhood, and of course, the thinner the wrist, the more delicate the woman was thought to be. Therefore, lace bracelets, elegant watch straps, and gold bracelets were used to emphasize this elegance. The elegance of the hands and wrists had to be supported by behavior. Women should not put their hands behind their heads. Fingers should never reach for something hastily. A cup taken with the fingertips, a book page turned gently, or a touch to a flower. These showed how a woman was raised. This, too, was part of womanhood. How you used your hand showed who you were. Still, achieving this ideal appearance was not always easy. There were even wooden molds used to stretch the fingers to make them appear longer. Gloves were made so tight that the woman had to struggle to put her hand into them. Because the tighter the glove, the smaller and more elegant the hand looked. This was a torture endured purely for aesthetics. But it was not well received for a woman to complain. Elegance had to be combined with silence. This beauty obsession was more universal than one might think. Small feet in China, long fingers in Europe. Both were expressions of similar codes. Shaping the body was one of the symbolic ways of controlling women, and of course, it was also one of the ways to make class distinction more visible. Some women, even if they were not noble, tried to assume this role with their hands. They rubbed their hands with lemon. They tried to soften them with potato peels at night. But if there were black marks under the nails, no matter how beautiful the hands were, it revealed the nobility was false. Over time, these aesthetic codes changed. After the Industrial Revolution, hands became the symbol of labor. A woman's strong hands began to represent her independence. But throughout history, the elegance of a thin-wrist hand was never forgotten. That hand, whether in a woman holding a notebook, a young girl folding a letter, or a noblewoman raising a glass, always whispered the same thing. I am distinguished, I am elegant. I rule without being seen. Perhaps the smile appearing on the face of a woman today who is happy to receive comments on social media about her beautiful hands is a silent echo of centuries of aesthetic heritage. If even the simplest limb of a woman's body determined her class, value, and womanhood, then we can recognize that many judgments still made based on appearance today are the shadow of those days. The morning light filtering through the window had not yet met the sleeping city. The young girl, upon waking, immediately turned her face to the veiled mirror. She slowly opened the small box in her hand. Inside was a mixture made of crushed saffron, dried roses, and gold dust. She applied it lightly to her face with her fingertips. She looked in the mirror and smiled. Her face was glowing, but not just from the gold. Beauty in that era was not merely a visual preference. It was a divine balance, a social class indicator, and a rite that determined a woman's destiny. Today, products like mascara, foundation, and lipstick can be found on cosmetic shelves. But in past centuries, beauty products came directly from nature, were mixed with rituals, and often became mysterious concoctions accessible only to the rich. These rituals were practiced not only to enhance physical beauty but also as a means of spiritual purification or social acceptance. For example, kohl applied to the nails was used not only for the eyes but also to enhance the elegance of the hands. Kohl, besides making the eyes appear larger, also made the nails look dark and distinct. This was a symbol that the person was both devoted to their care and cultured. This tradition persisted in Egypt, Rome, and even in Ottoman palaces. Gold dust was the most luxurious representative of beauty. Finely ground gold particles were usually mixed with honey and applied to the face. This not only made the skin shine but also gave the woman a radiant appearance. During the Renaissance, this practice was so popular that some women never omitted gold from their daily care routines. However, this was also a status indicator. Not everyone had gold at home. A woman who applied gold to her face was practically proclaiming her nobility. Alongside kohl and gold dust, other substances were used in beauty rituals. Crushed pearl powder was used for skin whitening, saffron for concealing under-eye dark circles, and rose oil for smoothing the skin. But what was remarkable was that these practices were not limited to physical transformation. These rituals were almost a form of meditation. While beautifying herself, a woman would also turn inward, contemplating her past, her destiny, her dreams. In some societies, these rituals also had religious meanings. For example, in India, the bindi women applied to their foreheads was not just an ornament but also an expression of the third eye. In ancient Anatolian cultures, brides would draw various motifs on their faces and hands on their wedding morning, wishing for fertility and happiness with these drawings. So, beauty was often a wish, a prayer, a form of protection. Of course, some of these rituals became harmful over time. Lead-based face powders, arsenic beauty lotions, mercury-blended ointments. Women lost their health for the sake of looking beautiful. But the mold society cast for them were so rigid that they often endured this pain in silence. Because if a woman was not beautiful, she was not seen as a good wife, a respectable individual, or a valuable being. This pressure did not only belong to the rich. Even peasant women developed their own rituals. Mixtures made at home with materials like turmeric, milk, and honey were applied to the skin overnight and left until morning. Hair was combed with rose water, teeth were cleaned with ash. Every class had created its own beauty codes. But there was one detail to note. The ritual was shaped not only by the material but also by intention. Women did not spend these care moments alone. Sometimes they would share this process with their mothers, sometimes with their sisters. Meanwhile, they would tell stories, whisper secrets, and express their hopes. Beauty would turn into a moment of purification and solidarity. Today, beauty rituals are much more accessible, but women still ask themselves the same question in front of the mirror. Am I beautiful like this? Perhaps the answer to this question lies not in gold dust, but in the sincerity of the moment, in the courage to be alone with oneself. Because in every period of history, beauty has been not an illusion, but a narrative. And this narrative has been patiently and hopefully written by women's hands. A foggy morning. Footsteps echoing on stone streets. A 13-year-old girl, the tips of her hair visible from under the shawl she's wrapped around her head. A blazing redness. The eyes watching from behind closed windows multiply. One makes the sign of the cross, another mutters a prayer. Her mother holds her hand tightly, but the girl is aware. Something will happen because of her hair. It had happened before. But she just loved the way her hair danced with the wind. People, however, saw this dance as a threat. Throughout history, red hair was much more than just a color. It was a symbol that was both feared and desired, both sanctified and cursed. Why? Because it was rare. Like everything rare, it attracted attention, but like everything that attracts attention, it invited danger. Especially for women. In medieval Europe, red-haired women were associated with witchcraft. A significant portion of the witches burned, according to European Inquisition records, had red hair. Because this hair color broke the routine of society. While dark-haired women were considered docile and blondes innocent, redheads were seen as rebellious, seductive, defiant, and even satanic. There were even regions where red hair was believed to be the mark of the devil. Religious leaders in their sermons directly defined this hair color as the sign of the fiend. But there was another side to the story. Especially in the art world, red hair was often depicted as seductive and fascinating. In Renaissance paintings, Beatrice's hair in Dante's Divine Comedy was fiery red. The Venetian painter Titian drew red-haired women so often that the term, Titian red, was born. So, it was possible to be both a witch and a muse at the same time. Red hair was the name of the paradox. In England, this perception took on a completely different dimension. Queen Elizabeth I was red-haired. During her reign, red hair almost turned into a royal symbol. Especially nobles tried to lighten and redden their children's hair by washing it with ginger. Because having that color was no longer just a curse, but also an indicator of power and prestige. But this did not become widespread among the common people. Because the street sets one set of rules, the palace another. This duality that followed red hair, of course, placed the heaviest burden on women. The attribution of a supernatural meaning to a natural characteristic caused them to struggle for their lives because of their hair. Some hid their hair, some dyed it, and some turned this hair into a symbol of resistance. Because along with their hair, gazes were also upon them. While one made them the object of desire, the other targeted them with hostility. In some regions, it was believed that red-haired babies needed to be purified as soon as they were born. Amulets were hung on them. Holy water was sprinkled. Some legends told that this hair glowed at night, connected its owner to the moonlight, or gave the ability to perform magic. It was far from reality but effective. Because people are very prone to demonizing what they cannot understand. Even when the modern era arrived, this historical burden on red hair was not completely erased. In media, literature, and films, red-haired characters are still presented in different, charismatic, dangerous, or seductive roles. This shows that the images etched into our subconscious by the past are still there. Yet, hair is just hair, but society turns it into a symbol. Today, red hair is being reinterpreted as an indicator of originality and courage. People deliberately carry this color in their hair, display it with pride, but this point was not reached easily. Behind it lie centuries of misconceptions, unjust punishments, burned bodies, and ostracized people. Perhaps that is why red hair is still the most beautiful form of rebellion. Because it is not just a pigment, it is a story. And this story is the silent but powerful voice of survival, of being yourself, and of taking pride in difference. On a Sunday morning, while church bells echoed from afar, a young woman was carefully trying to draw a black line around her eyes in a small mirror she held. A bit of color on her cheeks, a slight shine on her lips. Just as she was about to go out, her mother grabbed her by the arm. "What are you doing? Did you adorn your eyes? This is disrespectful to God." The woman bowed her head, and as she wiped off her makeup, these words fell from her lips. "But I just wanted to feel a little beautiful." In the Victorian era and the Europe just before it, there was a strange tension between the understanding of beauty and piety. A conspicuous adornment like eye makeup was only acceptable in certain areas and social contexts. But the church was not one of them. On the contrary, a woman going to church was expected to be as plain, colorless, and almost invisible as possible. Because appearing before God adorned was associated with ostentation, pride, and even lust. Eye makeup has carried different meanings throughout history. In ancient Egypt, it was a protective ritual. In ancient Rome, a status symbol. But from the Middle Ages onwards, with the influence of Christianity, a great distance was placed from these practices. Especially emphasizing the eyes was seen as trying to attract others' attention and was considered a sin. During this period, a woman applying kohl around her eyes or making her eyelashes prominent was perceived as a sign of moral looseness. In the Victorian era, things were a bit more complex. Although it appeared to be a conservative and religious society from the outside, working-class women, especially in brothels, theaters, or performing arts, had made makeup part of their identity. But eye makeup was still a bold step. Because the eye was seen as the door opening directly to the soul, and adorning it meant a blurring of intention. If a woman wore eye makeup, the question, "For whom?" automatically arose. If she was going to church, this created an even greater outrage. Since the place of worship was considered a place of armor, humility, and introspection, physical adornment was perceived almost as mockery. Society, when it saw a woman with eye makeup, would divide her into two: either she is of loose morals or she is in a state of heedlessness. There seemed to be no third option. Actually, the issue here was not just makeup. It was a woman's desire to have a say over her own body. A woman who accentuated her eyes wanted to be seen. But this was dangerous in the social order of that period. A woman being seen could mean the birth of desire, and thus the disruption of order. Therefore, even small touches like eye makeup were considered rebellious. Interestingly, women in the noble class secretly wore eye makeup, showing it only at private balls or closed invitations. This practice, which was both a sin and a beauty standard in the same society, also turned into a class distinction. If the rich did it, it was refinement; if the poor did it, it was immorality. In church, either was acceptable. Over time, this situation created contradictions within women's inner worlds. They wanted to give color to their eyes but were afraid of being seen. They wanted to express themselves but were taught to be silent. Because only men could look. Women were only supposed to exist enough to be looked at. So what has changed today? Perhaps the techniques, colors, and products have advanced, but some of those old judgments are still alive. A woman's reason for wearing makeup is still questioned. The question, "Who are you adorning yourself for?" is still asked. And a woman without makeup can be declared unkempt, while a woman with makeup can be declared ostentatious. But in fact, eye makeup is a choice, an outward form of expression. For some it is power, for others art, for others an ordinary routine. It is neither a sin nor an obligation. It is only about how a person wants to see themselves. And perhaps the main issue is this: what does a person see when they look at themselves in the mirror? Imagine. You are a guest at a great dynasty's house. You are sitting at a dazzling table. Candlesticks are burning. Music is slowly resonating. Then the lady of the house smiles, but there is something strange. Her teeth are pitch black, lined up like jet black pearls. She is smiling, but you are frozen. Is this a disease? You think to yourself. Whereas, she is presenting herself in her most beautiful form. Because for her, those black teeth are a kind of expression of wealth, the echo of nobility in a smile. Many things that are considered flaws according to today's aesthetic understanding were seen in the past as indicators of splendor, beauty, and even morality. Blackening teeth was one of them. Especially in some periodic cultures of Asia and Europe, pearly white teeth were considered a symbol of poverty, naturalness, and even savagery. Whereas black teeth symbolized a married woman's loyalty to her home, her husband, and her place in society, while bright white teeth were interpreted as a sign of youth, purity, and being outside of marriage. This tradition was not limited to Japan. In the Victorian era, the subject of dental aesthetics was also an area of debate in Europe. Having very white teeth was associated in some circles with peasantry, outdoor life, and a coarse existence. Teeth not being shiny was equivalent to elegance, especially for women. Because this implied that one did not eat frequently, did not laugh constantly, and perhaps did not talk too much. But black teeth were associated not only with aesthetics but also with health. Substances contained in the mixture used to blacken teeth, such as iron and sulfate, were even considered beneficial in some regions because they prevented tooth decay. So, the black smile gained meaning for both symbolic and practical reasons. Why did people do this? Because the beauty codes of that era were the complete opposite of our modern obsession with natural beauty. What was natural was considered raw. External intervention was not artificiality, but an expression of care and status. Someone who blackened their teeth was giving the message, "I have the money and knowledge for this procedure." At the same time, these people held a respected position in society, and this differentiation gave them visibility. Of course, not everyone liked this practice. Over time, this habit was looked down upon, especially in regions with increasing Western influence. The wave of modernization, along with white teeth becoming a symbol of cleanliness and development, turned black smiles into a cause for shame. But this still did not diminish the value of the past intention. Like every tradition, this one also gained meaning with the norms of its own time. If someone blackened their teeth today, they would probably be found contrary to smile aesthetics or ugly. Whereas if the same person lived years ago, they might even be accepted among the nobles. Because aesthetics is not as universal as we think. It constantly changes under the influence of time, society, and even beliefs. In one period, golden teeth were as valuable as jet black teeth were envied in another. Just imagine, there was an obsession like today's white teeth obsession, but in the opposite direction, and people were willing to suffer pain and use special mixtures for days for it. Moreover, behind that smile, there were not only beauty but also deep social meanings like belonging, marriage, maturity, and wealth. Perhaps that is why things that seem strange when we look at the past were actually quite meaningful for the people of that era, and our task is to try to understand these details before judging them. Because every smile is shaped within time, and every color tells a story. Think of a tired man. He has worked all day and is returning home. There is a letter waiting for him at home. He has been invited. He will have a place at the most prestigious ball of the era that night. While dressing, he looks in the mirror, adjusts his tie, dusts off his jacket, combs his hair back. But what really catches his attention is his wife's appearance. She stands before him like a statue, with her thin waist, puffy skirt, and a corset extending down her back. The woman is smiling, but she cannot breathe. This is not beauty, it is a difficulty. Throughout that night, not her conversations, but her breaths will be heard. Because that night, a visual feast of a body built with clothes will be presented. The Victorian era was one of those times when beauty was created from illusion, not naturalness. What plastic surgeons do today was done back then by tailors and fashion designers with fabric, stitching, and lacing. Bodies were shaped not to reflect reality but to conform to the aesthetic codes of that period. Every woman had to be elegant, but this elegance never came with a natural body form. Corsets were the most well-known tools. These garments, reinforced with steel boning, standing like bones within the fabric, narrowed women's waists to as little as 40 centimeters. This was not just a matter of appearance. With these clothes, women could not eat comfortably, walk easily, and sometimes were squeezed enough to faint. The question, "Why do women always faint?" even found a place in medical books of the time. The truth was in the clothing. But this was not only true for women. Men also constructed their socialite identities with fake shoulder pads, canes, and perfumes. In those days, a gentleman was measured by the importance he gave to his appearance. If his hat was crooked, his trousers unirond, or his collar dirty, he could be accused not only of an aesthetic but also of a moral decline. Women wore several layers of petticoats under their puffy skirts and had special clothes tailored to make their hips look larger and their torsos narrower. It was impossible to sit with some garments. Because when you sat down, your skirt would topple, your corset would dig into your ribs. But no one cared about that. The important thing was to appear that way. Another interesting aspect of this false aesthetic mania was that it clarified class distinction. Bodies created with artifice were perfect for distinguishing the rich from the poor at first glance. A peasant woman had a thick waist and calloused hands. A city woman's waist had to look like a swan's, her fingers like a violin bow. The difference had to be drawn not only by income but also by body. Bodies created by clothing became so widespread that people became alienated to naked bodies. The real body could only be seen in the bathroom or in front of a doctor. In fact, some men went into shock when they saw their wives naked for the first time on their wedding night. Because the aesthetic illusion was so powerful that women had almost turned into living architectural works. In this period, a beautiful body meant not the natural one, but the compressed, suppressed, lifted, hidden body. Perhaps your chest was small, but it could be made to appear large with a dress. Perhaps your hips were flat, but they could be padded. Perhaps your stomach was protruding, but it could be made straight with a corset. And what emerged at the end of all this was a beauty standard that no one truly possessed. But this illusion had a cost. Shortness of breath, compression of internal organs, digestive problems, spinal curvatures. Perhaps corsets have become popular again today as an aesthetic product, but historically they were a symbol of pain endured for the sake of beauty. And in this false aesthetic age, people were hiding not only their bodies but also their selves. Because everyone's identity was measured by the length of their skirt, the thinness of their waist, the angle of their hat. The reality beneath the appearance was unimportant. Perhaps today we are not so different. We make ourselves beautiful with filters, apps, and makeup. But we must not forget that this cycle is not new. Only the tools have changed. The corset of that era is the Photoshop of today. And perhaps that is why understanding the bodies created by the clothes of the past allows us to see today's aesthetic pressures more clearly. A young girl walking on a rainy London street one morning. The hem of her skirt is stained with mud. The sky is gray, the wind cuts her face, but there is a strange vitality on her face. Her cheeks are bright red, her lips a dark pink close to purple. A man passing by lifts his head and looks at her. Then another. The girl smiles, but this smile is not sincere. Those colorful cheeks are the product of a chemical mixture she applied without knowing its contents, not of healthy skin. No one knows. That girl is being slowly poisoned every day for her beauty. In the Victorian era, looking healthy was a sign that you came from a good family, ate cleanly, and were close to nobility. Paleness was considered sickness, colorfulness vitality. But the interesting thing was that this vitality was often not real but artificial. If there was no natural blush, what was done? Makeup, of course. But this makeup was not as innocent as today's foundation. Compounds containing mercury, lead-based pigments were used to give lively color to the cheeks. Insect extracts, arsenic lipsticks, and even pieces of cloth soaked in wine were applied to lips to make them look darker. Women had turned into chemistry laboratories for their beauty, but without being chemists. The most popular mixture applied to cheeks was rouge. This word of French origin directly means red. It sometimes contained iron oxide, sometimes cinnabar, a mercury compound. Although these substances provided a pleasant redness in the short term, in the long run they irritated the skin, causing scaling, flaking, and even permanent damage. How ironic, isn't it? While trying to look healthy, poison was actually being worked into the skin. The dyes applied to lips were not innocent either. Cosmetic manufacturers used purple mustard extract, lead acetate, and arsenic mixtures to obtain darker and more permanent colors. Some women made mixtures of beeswax and animal fat to make their lips look shinier. Even if these mixtures melted and dripped during the day, it wasn't considered a problem. Because appearance was incomparably more important than health. Makeup was not only about beauty but also a status indicator. A pale face reminded one of a servant working indoors. A woman with red cheeks and dark lips was a society woman dancing at balls, hosting guests, attracting attention. So, aesthetics was not just aesthetics. It was a social calling card. Some women exaggerated their blush, applying beetroot or raspberry juice directly to their faces. Although this seemed natural, it caused irritation when left on the skin for a long time. Still, this painful beauty was an accepted price in that era. Because everything was for looking alive. What you experienced deep down didn't matter. The color on your face suppressed the truth. Interestingly, some women expended physical effort to raise their own blood pressure. They climbed stairs, walked fast, slapped their faces. Thus, they tried to achieve natural redness. Because they wanted to look authentic. Even this authenticity was the result of a fake effort. Over time, these chemical makeup products began to threaten women's health. Persistent spots on their skin, nervous system disorders, headaches, even miscarriages occurred. But the problem was not in a beauty product, but in a societal expectation. Because in that era, women were given the duty not of beauty, but of looking beautiful. At any cost. For men, however, red cheeks were often a sign of drunkenness or excessive sunbathing. So, makeup belonged only to women? Men were natural. Women had to be processed. This was another dimension of the cultural pressure applied to women's bodies. Because even a woman's very existence had to pass an aesthetic test. When we look today, red cheeks and dark lips may still evoke vitality for us. But in the past, there was another story behind these colors. Skin stained with lead, nerves ruined by arsenic, bodies exhausted by mercury. That's why let's ask ourselves now, was beauty really about being healthy? Or was it about mistaking unhealthy things for beauty? Perhaps the real sickness was normalizing poisoning oneself for the sake of appearance. A young woman in her 20s. Her name is Eleanor. She wakes up every morning. She combs her hair by touch. She feels her face with her hands. There is neither a mirror in her room nor a clean water container in which she can see her reflection. She cannot see her face. She only feels that something is missing from her mother's disapproving looks, the whispers of neighbor women, the men in the market who avert their eyes. Because in Victorian London, beauty was measured not by sight but by word. There was no mirror, but there was plenty of commentary. In today's world, the subject of beauty is often mirrors. A person looks at themselves and makes their own decision. But in the Victorian era, most women had no access to mirrors. Especially if one was from the lower class, owning a mirror was a luxury. Those who had money kept the mirrors in their homes covered. Because looking in the mirror too much was considered prideful. Therefore, a woman's ability to feel beautiful was shaped by what others told her. Beauty was a judgment. A label that came from another's lips and was imprinted on a woman's mind. Society's understanding of beauty was uniform. White skin, small features, thin waist, low voice tone. But these ideals were merciless towards those not born with them. Thousands of women like Eleanor evaluated themselves through the comments of others. Your cheeks are chubby, your hair is too dark, your eyebrows are thick. Beauty was shaped by criticism. The mirror didn't show, but everyone said what they wanted to say. For men, beauty was not a necessity, it was a detail. For women, it was a condition of existence. When Eleanor went to the market, she wasn't just choosing fruit. She was also weighing whether she was beautiful in the eyes of a grocer who looked at her and tried to smooth his mustache. When a flower woman said, "My girl, I wish you'd wear a little blush," a needle pierced Eleanor's heart. Because beauty was synonymous with receiving respect. The beautiful were listened to more, judged less. Over time, women withdrew into themselves. Since there was no mirror, they began to imagine their own likenesses. These imaginings were shaped by the comments they heard. If a woman one day heard, "What sweet eyes you have," she would think her eyes were beautiful. But if the next day someone said, "Your nose is a bit big," that belief in beauty would begin to crack. Thus, women constructed their own likenesses from the sentences of others. This was both fragile and far from reality. Over time, beauty began to be shaped more by comparison. When Eleanor went to her cousin's wedding, she counted her own shortcomings by looking at other women. Her dress is shinier, her hair neater, her smile more graceful. Beauty was now being corrupted not only by commentary but also by comparison. Every woman was afraid of being lacking next to another. Because society had turned beauty into a competition. Being dependent on comments instead of a mirror shattered self-confidence. Women adjusted their self-worth according to external voices. Someone who can look in the mirror today and say, "I am beautiful," wouldn't even dare to think that in that era. Because self-satisfaction was a sin, silent acceptance was a virtue. Even if Eleanor found herself beautiful one day, she couldn't share it with anyone. Because there was no mirror. But there was judgment, there were comments. And these comments did not allow the woman to be honest even with herself. The most painful part was that the definition of beauty was determined by men and implemented by women. Women evaluated each other according to the male gaze. What men said became the norm. That's why millions of women like Eleanor were never actually beautiful for themselves. They always strived for the appreciation of another. Finally, Eleanor managed to fit a mirror into her mirrorless years one day. But when she looked in the mirror, she saw not herself but the sentences she had heard. Her mother's dissatisfied look, the grocer's indifference, the neighbor's jealous comment. The mirror was not just a piece of glass. It was a curtain where all the words of the past had gathered. Eleanor saw there not her own face, but the face society had assigned to her. And if you've come this far, you must have noticed too. Beauty does not always start in the mirror. Sometimes people's words, gazes, and silence become the most powerful mirror. But when those mirrors break, what remains behind? On the Sleep and History channel tonight, we journey to the most secret corners of the past. If you also like this narrative, you can support us by using the thank you button below the video, and you can share interesting beauty rituals from the past you know in the comments. Until we meet again in new stories. Close your eyes. We will continue to tell